Oh, hello there, everybody. Yo, awesome. While we're waiting for this, I've been loving the shoes here on the staff members. There's some amazing shoes down there. There's some great ones on the people that have been speaking. That's just brilliant. Oh, I get a headset. Okay. Okay, great, cool. I will continue talking while I figure this out, which might be this way. No. Oh, there we go. Okay. Over the ear. Oh, that's better. That's much better. All right, got this. Oh, hello, everybody. Now I sound good. Thank you. Whew. Okay, cool. So, I am going to talk to you guys and ladies about the idea of open source by default. So, this is me. My name is Orta Therox, and I work at a smallish startup over in the UK and in New York City called Artsy. And this is really relevant to what I want to talk about because a lot of the things that I will be talking about refer to our value system. There we go, hooked in properly. So, start off. What is the company Artsy? So, we aim to bring all of the world's art online. And we start this in New York City, and the entire idea is that anybody should be able to access all of the world's art by just having an internet connection. There we go. That sounds a bit better. One of the key points that we do in order to try and establish how we should be making decisions within our company is by having a strong, established value system. And a value system allows us to make hard decisions. Oof, there we go. Allows us. What are you thinking? Am I doing something wrong? Is that good? Thank you. Okay. Yeah, that sounds much better. Perfect. Okay. We have these core 5. Who's laughing? We have these core 5 values. Let's see if we can do it if it doesn't get terrible. The key one is the things that we want to build should be at the intersection of art meets science. What this roughly means is that the work that we do should intersect both art and it should be valuable to the programming community as a whole. We should also consider that as individuals, we care about the people that are working on the tools that we make. So in our case, we want to care that as individuals, any group decisions we make should be positively affecting every single person. We want to make sure that the things that we create where I work are good enough for the artworks that we are displaying. So we talk a lot about, is the thing that we are doing making the artworks better? We then try and have positive energy. I've been doing a lot of talks lately for the last year or two about the idea that being in the open source world there's a large amount of negativity in there, and we want to try and be as nice as possible, and I summarize that as being nice is nice. Finally, we have a value called openness. And openness is this idea that we work inside the art world, and the art world is this big, monolithic tool where in order to get in, you really have to have been born into the art world. It's very opaque, it's hard to see in, and it's very hard to actively contribute. And so these are the key 5 values that exist for Artsy the company. And it's relevant in part because I effectively use these 5 values to force my company into doing things that I really want as a developer. And so, the things that I want as a developer is to work in the open source community. I grew up in the UK with not much of a local community and just existed entirely online. By the time I was 17, I had a tattoo that is all about open source, and now I'm about 30, and I'm still strongly believing in the ideas. And the idea is that I want to be able to use my work in the open source community to have an impact. And the way that I managed to start doing this is around 2013, I started thinking, I'm going to start devoting considerable amounts of my own personal time to open source. But the question was to me, where should I be doing this? At this point, I had almost 10 years experience of real world development, and I was like as experienced as I needed to be. And so I started trying to pick what was the project that I could have the most impact on in the entire world. And for me, that was a tool called CocoaPods. If you've heard of NPM or Ruby Gems or Chocolate, I think, for .NET, it's just another dependency manager. But one of the interesting things is that instead of attacking the problem of, I want to work on a dependency manager, I instead attack the problem of, how do we document? How do we do better guides? How do we do blogging? How do we actively take this programming tool and turn it into a bigger and more inclusive community? For example, one of my favorite now things that I've done with CocoaPods is we released socks. And we have sold about 200 odd socks in the last year to people that use this tool. And these are not traditional ways in which you contribute to open source. But all of them are totally ways in which anybody can do so. And CocoaPods is this big project. So it affects roughly 500,000 iOS apps. When GitHub released some statistics recently, they said that we had been downloaded and cloned roughly 1 million times, putting it at like the top 5 Git repos on GitHub. And so any sort of impact that we can create inside CocoaPods effectively multiplies based on the work that we're doing day to day. So it's great that I can have a very large impact through my open source, but for a large time period, my actual work was a little bit of a smaller impact. The stuff that I was doing in my spare time had this like worldwide effect on almost every single iOS developer, and tried to establish like cultural norms that would work through all the other communities. But my work at Artsy, my day-to-day job, only had an impact on the art world. And yes, the art world is pretty big. It is a very large market. And that's pretty valuable, but I wanted to have more of an impact than just in the art world on my day-to-day life. So it gets exhausting coming back from work and then carrying on working on your open source as a separate tool. So I started to think, well, what are the ways in which we could fix that problem? And what are the ways in which we can start impacting not just ourselves and the art world, but start thinking, how can we impact the larger community of developers within which we sit? So the only way in which we could start doing that was to try and change the mindset of our team. And the way that I tried to summarize this is that I wanted to make the Artsy mobile team entirely transparent. And what this meant is that it allowed a lot of other people to have ways of seeing into the process that we have in our entire development flow. So for example, all of our commits are available on GitHub. And this is for commercial applications, multiple of them. We have all of our process available too. So in this case, this is our milestones, so what's coming up soon. But it also talks a little bit about how do we deal with sprint planning. How do we deal with, right now we're all having discussions about whether we should be vending our libraries inside a Git repo. And these are public discussions that we have available for everyone with the entire community that we can use to both improve our own processes and also get feedback back from other people that may be more informed. We make sure that all of our code reviews are done in the public. And remembering that this is something that is done in public means that we end up doing better code review. We try and make sure that every single pull request in this case is entirely atomic. So I expect that there will be a large amount of people who do not work in the company that I work on reading the pull requests that we send. Thus, we try and make sure everybody can understand the entire system when we're trying to describe what is happening in these code reviews. We also have our design and our QA process done entirely on GitHub too. This means that when we get bug reports, they go into GitHub issues, and we have designers who also come into GitHub issues and effectively show us how we should be improving different parts of our application. And this gives a lot of insight into how we convert designs into code, and how we convert code into a fully fleshed out product. And these parts of the transparency are super valuable to us as a team. And finally, one of the things that we treat as a feature is that we need to make sure that anybody can just download and run our code. It's very easy to have something that you ship available as open source, but it's only that the source is available and nobody else can really take it, compile it, and create their own versions of it. So we spend a large amount of time, and we treat it as a bug every time an open source contributor cannot just compile by running 4 commands in a row. But this entire thing, whilst now I can tell you all of this process is available for everybody to introspect and to see transparently, didn't just happen overnight. It took a long time, and it took a lot of patience. It took roughly 2 years. The process in which we did this was we started out small. So we started out by creating open source libraries, contributing back to existing libraries. Some of my projects have the most amount of dependencies in the iOS ecosystem. And then once we got to a point where it was now very well abstracted through libraries, we started to talk to the rest of the company that maybe the next thing we build should be available for anybody as open source by default. And then from that, if that idea works, then we'll start taking our older projects and we'll start bringing those back in and we'll start making those available for everybody else. And I'm going to talk you through a little bit of this process. So maybe I've got some of you convinced that you're going to go out there and you're going to go back and you're going to say, I would like to start working in the open. But how do you do that? Well, first of all, you have to sell everybody else in the process. Unless you work in a company with maybe 2 or 3 people that are all developers, then you actually have to actively explain to people what the open source process is, and the upsides and the downsides that are involved in opening your code base to anybody else to look at. So one of the first points I made to the rest of our team is that the Artsy company is not going to be the first people to go and do open source by default. There are tons and tons of other people that are doing this thing already. In our case, the website for the company I work at, Artsy, was already open source. So pitching that our iOS apps should go open source was not very hard. There are tons and tons of existing applications. So sorry, I only know the iOS world, but things like Telegram is open source and available for anybody to use. And there's a few more. I only know encrypted chat things. And so we wanted to say that, okay, so we're going to start with our libraries. That's easy. We're going to then move on to something that is fresh and thus available for anybody to start working on. So we took it step by step. And I wanted to explain to people that we're going to do these ideas bit by bit. So first we're going to open source our libraries, and then we're going to open source an entirely new application. This new application is an experiment that could work. It could also fail. And if it fails, the only thing that will have not worked for us is an application that we have just started on. And we can close it up, box it away, and the idea of open source by default can just be closed. It didn't, but it was worth trying, and it was worth part of the pitch. From there, I started to explain that we have these Artsy value systems, and these value systems are things like people are paramount. And we wanted to be able to say that as developers, we could lower the barrier to entry to anybody into the iOS community by open sourcing the things that we have and the processes and the designs and the QAs. These are problems that when I first started programming, I had no idea how to do. And that is part of what I call the path from informed to expert. So I started programming roughly 10, 15 years ago as a Mac developer. And there's basically no Mac development schools or tutorials on the internet. I just had to go and buy a book. And once I'd finished the book, I was just left with what next? And from my perspective then, I would go and download other people's source code, compile it, start running it, trying different plugins and trying to figure out what makes this thing tick. And we, as a company, want to help people get past that point. It can help us get juniors, but more importantly, it feels great to help people go from I just know something to now I feel like a domain expert. And we wanted to do that through our open source. And finally, we wanted to make sure that we were opening up our processes. We were a small company trying to figure out how do we work with the rest of the world, and we were still like running by the seats of our pants, which is a British phrase. So we were still trying something new. And we wanted to figure out how does this work. So by opening it up and allowing other people to come in and give us great advice for free, it was a brilliant way to like find out what the best tactics within the community were. And so this worked out really well for us. And finally, it is amazing as a developer to start thinking about how do I work in the open entirely. I think the simplest pitch is that every time we have a massive, hard problem, we just create a beautifully well-illustrated issue on our GitHub, and almost the entire community flocks to it and discusses all of the problems in this one singular place. I think in this example here, we had app launch time increased, which effectively affected a very, very large subset of the iOS community. And so all of the Apple compiler engineers, we had all of the people that worked on the tools that we work on, all came to the same issue and started discussing it all in the same place. And by having, it's another great British phrase, by having everything in one place available for anybody else to see, then suddenly we could centralize all of the information. We found that it was great for getting questions from the community about how we did things. It's quite often that I will just refer to an idea. In this case, I referred to an idea that there is such a thing as a hybrid app, which roughly means that you build an app out of web pages and native code together and jam it together. You'll have seen tons of these in existence, but somebody didn't understand that when I referred to it, and they actually went onto our project and made an issue specifically around the problem. And we helped them go from someone who didn't understand the concept to now strongly understood it, and then we made a blog post to like finish the job. And by doing this process, we both have to be very sure about the decisions that we've made, and we can be very discreet in our answers. I love this one. Signal boost is this idea. Whoa, sorry. Yeah. The signal boost is this idea that we get on juniors in our team, and these juniors can come in with zero experience in the world of iOS in this case, and we can take them from being someone who has never really contributed to open source and start making their work available for the public and to really raise their profile within the community. You can tell in this case that around September, we open sourced our final app and made it available for everybody else to see. And so her work suddenly became extremely public knowledge. And she could start making these references to her work, both in her own personal stuff, as well as knowing that from this point on, all of her work is now available for the rest of her career to her. So by making it open source, she can effectively say, I now don't lose source code if I move jobs. And that's a really useful thing when you're working on the same problem each time. If you're just making new apps, then effectively you are trying to solve the same problem again and again. We found that by open sourcing our apps, it was really, really easy to write blog posts, which is something that we keep bringing up again and again and again, because for us, this is an important part of community contributions. We want to be writing blog posts as the why we did something. Code review is talking about the how that you've done something, but it's sometimes difficult to try and understand how did someone, well, why did someone come to the decision that they came to? Sorry. And we find that by having something open and available, and by being able to write blog posts about these systems, suddenly the documentation for large, complicated things becomes part of your day-to-day process, which is once a week, you try and write a blog post about something that exists inside your application. By doing that, you are both raising your own profile, raising Artsy's profile, and more importantly, documenting the whys of the decisions that you've made that make the app. And finally, if you work in a company and have struggled with trying to hire people, having the idea of open source by default is an unbelievably great pitch. It means that people can work in the open. It means that people will literally flock to you. When we had this jobs page up, we were getting maybe 6 or 7 senior inbound iOS engineers a week for a small company of 4 or 5 people working together on the mobile team. And this is a considerable amount of job applications. So it is a great one for your company too. If you are trying to hire, then telling people that the work they could do will be available for everybody else to see, to be able to stay with you for the rest of your career, and that you can then build on this for the rest of your life is an incredible pitch. And the final best bit for me is that we get to really show people what our team culture is like. We get to say that, yes, people is paramount, is a value to the company I work for, and so is openness. But you can see it. You can go and look in these pull requests. You can look in our issues in the way that we hold ourselves in public. And you can actually see the way that we act corresponds to how we want to act. And it works really well for hiring. So one of the things that people ask very often was, when you started doing this, what was your expectations about community contributions? And effectively, we have no expectations about community contributions. For us, we work on a commercial application that has a pretty limited amount of people that overlap between iOS developers and art collectors. So we don't actually expect people to be sending us code, but we do expect people to be sending us bug reports. And understanding our expectations was quite important because up front, at first, we did think that we might actually get code contributions. But in reality, it was definitely not true. People contribute to libraries, but they never contribute to apps in our experience. But this may be specific to like iOS. This may also be specific to building things for art galleries. So deal with it. OK, so let's do it. Here's one of the things. In my opinion, most of our apps are CRUD. And what that means is they do 4 things. They create a resource, they read a resource, they update a resource, and they destroy a resource. I know, shocking. Anyone that's ever worked in databases will have heard this terminology. Effectively, as iOS apps, the things that we create are just generally, and there are definitely special cases, take some server resources, drop them into a device, and then send some data back from a device. And what that really means is that we are creating these really great, pretty pictures of data. And the work that I do is obviously special and obviously important, and it is actually of real business value, but my apps are not special. They are not like these special cases of a unique piece of work that doesn't touch anybody else's, that doesn't need to share abstractions. And it's very likely that, yes, my apps are valuable and they're useful, but they are just pieces of data. The thing about Artsy is that Artsy is about this idea of having all of this art online. It's about the relationships between galleries, the relationship between auction houses and museums and fairs, and trying to take all of this data and present it in a beautiful way to as many people as possible. And the problem with that is, well, the iOS app is just a conduit. It's just to get a way to take this data and present it to somebody. So when we open source our applications, we're not open sourcing our business. And thus, that does not put us at a business risk. Whew. So that's for the majority. However, there is one single app that we do have that does have a business risk. And this is an app called Folio. So here it is. It is a beautiful portfolio gallery tool for galleries. And it is the idea that your gallery will have this tool with them. They will go off to an art fair, which is basically a conference in the art world, and they'll use this to show off their works as they're selling it to people. It's a very simple idea, and we've been working on this for about 4.5 years now. But it has a problem, in that if we open sourced it, it would be very easy to bootstrap a competing business off this code. It is a very simple-ish app, but it has a large amount of competitors. It is a space in which a lot of other companies only exist to make portfolio apps for art galleries. And that makes it a little bit difficult for us to start thinking the conversation of how do we open source this app? So I said earlier at the start, we started out by abstracting our libraries so that we had as much of our core code as open source as possible. And then we started moving into the idea of new things should be open source. And that was great. And then we started thinking, okay, how do we take existing code bases open source? And Folio here was the last application, in part because of the complicatedness about trying to decide, does open sourcing this app hurt our business? So let's look at it again. I'm going to use some iOS terminology, but not too much. This is a really simple looking app, regardless of this. If I take it into a developer tool that we have, which is called Reveal, which effectively shows the view hierarchy, so that's the DOM. What it does is allows us to look at the components that create an application. So in this case, this thing here is called a collection view. If I think it's called a grid view or a recycle view in Android. I don't think you have something like this in web world. But it's basically something provided to you by an operating system. And then the same along the top, it's just a toolbar. I think in Android it's called a menu. And these two pieces come together to make the entire user interface for our application. And one of the problems here is that this application is actually really simple. If someone wanted to compete with us based on this application and bootstrapping off our application, they could probably prototype it in less time than it would take for them to try and take their data and put it inside our application. And so part of the pitch of open sourcing this app was that it's actually super simple to copy. And the real value, again, is not necessarily in the actual app itself, but in the relationship with the galleries that we have. For them, it's just another tool as a part of Artsy. For us, it's an important tool that we use to pitch them. So one of the other things that we had to do with this code base is this was, in the iOS world, 4.5 years is a very, very long time to be maintaining the same code base. And a code base that is 4.5 years old is full of hacks. And that's okay. And it's just part of reality. We actually have a file in our code base for every single app that we have released that is called hacks. And all it is just a text file that is a list of all the times where we have made a, how do I describe this? A quality versus actually shipping something trade-off. And I'm not sure where the answer for this is. I don't necessarily feel like we are shipping code bases, we are shipping apps. And it just happens to be that we are open sourcing these code bases. And so they're available for everybody else to see. And so when we brought it back to, do we feel that the code bases work with our idea of quality worthy of art, we felt that they did, even if they do have a collection of hacks in them. Whew. Okay. Getting there. Right, next points. So, there's this other idea. Working in the open means that it's very hard to hide something. So, some good examples. There's an app called Path that was both on Android and on iOS, and there's obviously Twitter. In the iOS world, Path would upload all of your phone's context up onto their servers without telling you about it. And on the iOS world for Twitter, Twitter would look at every single app you had installed and also send all those up to Twitter so that it could do better ads for you. In both of those cases, Apple changed their APIs specifically to not allow these cases. And you get the feeling that if an individual developer had to put their name on that feature, there would have been a lot more pushback about actually shipping something that is genuinely not good for a user, but great for the actual company. And for the case of Artsy, we would be quite cautious, and we'd use the value of people are paramount to argue maybe you shouldn't be doing this. But there's a much bigger example that has come up in the last year that, for me, kind of really systemizes the idea of what openness by default allows. And that example is Volkswagen. This year, there was a giant emissions scandal where they started not accidentally, where for years they have been lying about the amount of emissions that their cars give out. So roughly, they pollute, and the engineers made sure that if you are running a car in a test, then it gives a very different amount of emissions than if you're doing it in real world. So when they were caught, the first reaction that came from the Volkswagen CEO was, engineers could not meet the US emission laws, and I can't quote it later down, but it says this was done by rogue engineers, effectively stating that the people that wrote the code were the people entirely at fault for this. And this is not just some small fault. This is $46 billion. That's the US fine that they had to pay. If you want it in rubles, that is 3,167 million rubles. It's a lot of money. You won't like the next slide, though. So it's a lot of money, sure. It's also accounted to almost 60 deaths, according to the peer-reviewed labs. That's a ton of stuff that has to sit on the engineers' shoulders of the people that had to make those decisions. And it's brutal. And it is like blamed entirely on them as individuals. And by doing it open, you can combat that secrecy that allows someone to blame it directly on the person that had to make that decision and that code at the end of the day. There will have definitely been a chain of command that said this is something we have to do, but the person at the bottom was the one that got the blame. And by having an entirely open process, you can stop that sort of thing from happening. And so part of my pitch for when I was building this is that it gives us a better foundation for the future in order to ensure that the team decisions we make are solid and are great for the users and for us as a company. Whew. However, I keep talking about how everything is open, how it's this beautiful utopia, and of course that's because I'm a keynote speaker and that's what I do. But reality is that you can't always do that. So for us, we found for building applications, there were 3 major components that generally had to stay closed. So we had to think about how do we deal with our environment keys. So that's things for production, for staging, for development. Those are things that really should stay closed. And every single ecosystem has an environment manager to deal with that. We found that we had assets that Artsy had paid for. The easiest example is fonts. For example, we use 2 fonts and we pay for both. And giving those out to everybody would probably get Adobe to sue us. And we don't want that. So we ended up sneakily finding that we have open source equivalents of our fonts that already exist out there. So we have, for open source developers, we have an open source variation of our fonts. But for ourselves, we have a closed source version. It was a beautiful way of working around the problem of being able to close some of our stuff, but being able to have open equivalents that allowed us to be able to keep the process running so that everybody else could work on it. And then finally, code. A lot of the time, you want to release something with a big bang. And if you are like a big company like Yandex, you probably do want to not release something until it's ready because of like the criticism you'd get all the way through the beta stages. And we found that we wanted to build an Apple Watch app, but we weren't really sure whether we wanted to release it. We weren't sure whether Apple would take well to us open sourcing a watch app while it was still in beta. And so we worked entirely in private on this one feature fork for a while we were still also working on our main app at the same time. So it was totally feasible that using something like Git, where you can have multiple remotes, that would allow us to work in the private until we needed to stop working in the private. And then shipping, ta-da! We have now got everything into the open. And this process was amazing. When we first thought about it, we thought we'd have to do everything in the open, but in reality, you can work partially in the open and then ideally ship it back. Great. Cool. So, is that a question? The question was, does occasionally working in the closed affect our values? And yes, it does. We consider that to be like a time-sensitive thing that we want to get rid of as much as possible. It's a lot like technical debt, but we would call it culture debt. So yes, it's not great, but we can work around it usually. Does that make sense? Not good, but makes sense. I agree. But we're still trying to ship apps. We're not trying to ship code bases, is generally how we pitch this. Okay, we're going to go for the final major point, impact. Through my work in the open source world, and through our work on trying to open source our work in the place I work, oof, a lot of words work, we managed to make an impact on Artsy that then we can use to make an impact on the open source community, that then we can make an impact on the entire world. And this process is about trying to understand that as an individual, we want to contribute to both our local communities and ourselves. We want to take these ideas and we want to expand on them further and further. We want to be able to go out to people, explain to them our ideas, to be able to say, this thing I have built is beautiful, and this abstraction I have built is amazing, and you can use this to then build better and better abstractions. I believe strongly in the idea that open source by default is one of the only ways in which you can really, really have an impact with your code base instead of just your application. The stuff that you do will have an impact locally. You can expand upon the impact that you have on a day-to-day basis by open sourcing your apps. Thus, I think you all should do that. You should be open sourcing your apps. Do it. Thank you. Thanks, Orta. It was a pleasure. Whew. That's a lot of tweets. Cool.
У нас есть время для пары вопросов.
Oh, we got question
Question.
time. Awesome.
Никто ничего не понял?
So,
With your main app, did you open source it or not?
yes, every single app that we have now is entirely open source. It took 2 years, and we eventually did it.
Еще? Бегу.
Oh, I should have repeated the question. The question was, is our main app entirely open source? And yes.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My question is, it's obvious that you open sourcing your app helped the entire community. But how did the community help you? Not only as developers, it's obvious you said about it, that they can help you on some questions, but did the feedback from the community improve your processes in any way?
Definitely. There have been bugs that we've had with Apple's operating system that I think we could have only got sorted by having such a large spotlight with which we can showcase. We spent a lot of time trying to understand how should we do team process, and that is like, what is sprint planning? What is sprint planning when you have to deal with an app store that means you have to wait at least a week for something to come out? And we actively engage in the community about like, how do these work? When we have ideas, we stub them out and put them up on like an ideas board. Well, specifically, we have a repo that exists just for these kind of culture questions. And quite a lot of people follow them and give us feedback, and they answer their own questions on there too. It's not like one way. We just post out our ideas and try and hope that other people are also thinking the same problems. So we don't get any good code contributions, but we do get quite a lot of interesting culture contributions.
Okay, thank you, Orta.
Right, thanks.
One question.
Actually, the most important question. So how you do you make money? And if you wouldn't have any connections to galleries,
Yes.
would you still make money?
If we had no connections to galleries, we would not make money. We make money by a subscription from galleries to be on our apps and website. So for us, the more people that are using the apps, the better. But for galleries, it's all about like, getting in front of as many people as possible, having as many good tools as possible, and being able to like sell more art through our system.
И последний вопрос.
Hi, I'm Nick. I'm from Turkey. Well, did I understand you right that you are building an iOS app?
Yes.
Well, in most countries, an iPhone is a thing of luxury, and not everybody, far from everybody, can afford it. How does that fit with the idea of art available for everybody?
Oh yeah. No, I get this all the time. We do have like work on Android, but like generally we treat the website as being the best Android client that we have. We don't have a team for iOS, and the people that buy art, and they're the people that we do really want to also market to. I know, but like they're the people that galleries want. So we try and focus a lot of our like more complicated experiences, so that's live auctions or being at a fair, around the iPhone. But when I talked earlier about a hybrid app, like we build the idea being that the core of the app is a website, and that is the mobile website. And on top of that, the native apps provide a better experience for specific things. So the Android app is the website, and it seems to be doing pretty good over there. But we're still looking to try and find a good way to do it and do a good native app for Android. We just haven't found the time or a team. But I agree entirely with your point, and it totally doesn't go well with our value system.
Thank you, thank you.